I would like to welcome you to the Centre for Initiatives of Change in the UK. And the theme this evening is Forgiveness, a Moral Minefield. Our speaker is Marina Cantacuzino, and she is the founder and the director of the Forgiveness Project. And that's an organisation which seeks to explore concepts of forgiveness and reconciliation through the real stories of victims and perpetrators.
So the reason I chose this subject, the title rather, Forgiveness, a Moral Minefield, is because I think forgiveness is an explosive subject. I've been working on it for nearly 10 years now. And it actually gets people very angry, often. And they don't just get angry because they think it's excusing an offence, but they get angry for all sorts of reasons. And I actually got quite angry the other day, so I thought I'd share that with you to start with. I went to a big event at St James's Piccadilly that was and someone was speaking there about forgiveness. And she was a kind of guru in personal development and healing and rebirthing. And she says, if you can't forget, you haven't forgiven. And if you haven't forgiven, you will be poisoned, mind, body and soul. And these were the messages that were coming out. And when everyone left, quite a number, I think, felt confused. Some felt scared. Some felt enthused, definitely. So it brought up all these different opinions. And it reminded me that forgiveness cuts public opinion down the middle like a guillotine. Really, forgiveness is risky. It's messy. It's difficult. It's costly. It's unpredictable. It's all these things. But, and the reason why I'm interested in it, is that it is actually transformative. So to illustrate how, strong feelings, Howard was mentioning Joe Berry and Pat McGee, and we brought them to the House of Commons at the 25th anniversary of the Brighton bomb. And I thought it was courteous to write a letter to Lord Tebbit, Norman Tebbit, whose wife had been very severely injured in the bomb, and he'd also been injured. And, I felt slightly awkward about it. I thought, at the very least, he should know. And I got a letter back, a very stern letter, in which he says, your project excuses, rewards and encourages murder. So that's a strong response. And fair enough, fair enough. But on the other hand, much, much more often we get this kind of response to the work we do. Sorry? I am going through something very difficult in my life right now. It's as though I'm walking a mountain's ridge. To one side lies the barren valley of anger, and to the other runs the river of forgiveness and inspiration. Through the online stories, the project has helped my journey. So the Forgiveness Project, which I founded in 2004, is an organisation which, as Howard says, uses storytelling, the real stories of victims and perpetrators of crime and violence, to explore concepts of forgiveness and reconciliation. And I suppose the very broadest aim is to inspire people to consider alternatives to revenge, retaliation and resentment. And the healing process is to pass from the narration of an offence as hurt feelings to the narration of an offence as an experience of significance, I think, essentially. And the reason I got into this was because back in 2002-3, it was the lead up to the Iraq War. And you'll recall that the language at the time was very much around retaliation and payback. And it was being spoken by politicians and by journalists, and that was generally the feeling of the culture at the time. That, combined with one day just seeing a small item on local London news about a father whose 3-year-old child had been accidentally killed in hospital by being given the wrong drug, and he was coming out of the inquest, and the journalist thrust a microphone under his nose and said, how did you feel being in the room with the surgeon or doctor who'd given the lethal drug? And he said something very surprising at that time. He said he'd seen the distraught doctor, he'd walked across the room, he'd held him in his arms, and he said, don't let this ruin your life too. I want you to know that I forgive you. And this and the noise and angry, bellicose language of revenge that was going on, I thought, I was a journalist with a small voice. I thought I need to do something. And I was doing quite a lot of travelling at the time with a photographer friend. And I said to him, why don't we just collect some stories about forgiveness and reconciliation? It was countercultural. It was to restore the balance in a funny kind of way. And I didn't know where it was going or anything. And we did that. Over a year we did that. So what is forgiveness? Big, big question. Dictionary definition is to give up resentment or the desire to punish. Desmond Tutu thinks that forgiveness, well, he thinks a lot about forgiveness, but one thing he said, it's about healing the memory of an offence, but not erasing it. So it's about taking hold of painful emotions and deciding to let them go, perhaps. Or is it about not allowing the pain of the past dictate the path of the future? One of my favourite quotes is what Mark Twain said, was that forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that crushes it. One way of looking at it is forgiveness as a social contract, a moral relationship between self and other. Margaret McKinney was someone I met during my research phase. She's an Irish woman whose son was abducted by the IRA. And for 20 years, she didn't know what had happened to him, though I think after 2 or 3 years, it became quite clear that he had been murdered. And this is what she says.
By then, I'd lost my faith in God. I was mad with rage and wanted only revenge. I asked the police to give me a gun. They said, Mrs. McKinney, we know what you'd do with it. And they were right. If I'd known who Brian's killers were, I would have gone out and killed their children. I wanted them to know how it felt.
And the reason I use that quote here is just to show how the journey can move from wanting actually the children of the perpetrator to suffer as your child did. And she now says, I often think about his killer coming to the door. I'd like to talk to him and ask if he's sorry for what he did and why no one ever told me what had happened. Until that happens, I can't say I forgive because I don't know who to forgive. And she talks about the fact that he should want peace now. He deserves peace now because she's found peace now. And she's not filled with hate. And yet she says, I can't forgive because I don't know who to forgive. So this is also another tricky subject, forgiveness and justice. Some people think that justice must come first and forgiveness can only come after justice. There's a very close relationship between justice and revenge. And restorative justice, of course, fits much more comfortably within the whole area of forgiveness. Restorative justice being personal justice, about not looking at who committed the offence and how can they be punished, but looking at how can we mend relationships that have been broken, relationships with the community, with the family, between victim and offender. So just consider this statement, written by 2 authors who have written a lot about authoritarian power. To forgive without requiring the other to change is not only self-destructive, but ensures a dysfunctional relationship will remain so by continually rewarding mistreatment. And you can see where that kind of fits into the whole battered wife syndrome. You can absolutely see what they're getting at there. But again, it kind of simplifies everything. And for me, it's too dogmatic. Because I know people who have not been able to change people, and they have been able to walk away from situations, and yet they've forgiven. And they've forgiven because they have some kind of empathy and understanding that that person can't change, that they're like that because of something that happened to them. And for instance, I have a someone who works with us closely in the prison, who had many years of abuse as a child from a member of her family. And she talks about, she comes into prison and talks about this, which you can imagine is quite a big deal. And she talks about how she's forgiven this member of her family. And the reason she has done so, she says, is that she cannot be tied to him any longer. She has some empathy, some understanding about why he might have done that. But she said, if I didn't forgive him, he would still be controlling me. He would still have the power. So forgiveness in that sense is just letting go and is very empowering. I would say the majority of the stories on the Forgiveness Project talk about forgiveness more in these terms, that it is an act of self-healing. And this statement here is about as good as any about that. Forgiveness has nothing to do with absolving a criminal of his crime. It has everything to do with relieving oneself of the burden of being a victim, letting go of the pain and transforming oneself from victim to survivor. These words were said by Pumla Gobodo Madikizela. She's a South African. She wrote A Human Being Died That Night, in which a large chunk of the book is her interviews with Eugene de Kock, who was a commander in the apartheid government in South Africa. And he did the most atrocious things. But what she means by this, I think, is, I will not retain the hatred that you showed me. And by reaching out with empathy, you're doing something that the perpetrator couldn't do. Primo Levi, the writer who was in the Nazi camps, says, I do not hate because I do not want to be like you. It's that kind of idea. And how do you forgive? Not only when someone shows no remorse, but when the offences have been so extreme and barbaric. And Marion Partington, who Howard mentioned, whose sister was killed by Fred and Rosemary West, she was put in a dungeon, she was tortured, she was dismembered. And Fred West committed suicide before the trial. Rosemary West is in prison now. And so Marion's journey is really about having found, trying to go towards forgiveness for Rosemary West. And it's been a very, very long journey. And she's actually went to the trial and she heard about where Rosemary West had come from and her very difficult childhood, how she herself had been raped at a very young age. That's Rosemary West. And Marion says her story seems to be about the impoverishment of a soul that knew no other way to live than through terrible cruelty. So in that sense, it's having empathy for someone who is imprisoned in their tormented, distorted mind. That's how I see it. That's how you have empathy, because that person is trapped with a brain that wants to do harm. People say forgiveness has to be earned, or it has nothing to do with the offender. But it can rehabilitate. So this is Arno Michaelis, who I met a year or so ago. And he was the founding member of the largest racist skinhead organisation in the world. He was astounded because people started reaching out to him, including survivors of the Holocaust from the local synagogue. And he says something I think very powerful. He says, forgiveness is a sublime example of humanity that I explore at every opportunity, because it was the unconditional forgiveness I was given by people who I once claimed to hate that demonstrated the way from there to here. The more I work in this area and the more I live and the more I see relationships around me tumbling and divorces and estrangements and friends breaking off with each other because they're offended and parents not talking to children, children not talking to parents, the more I think that forgiveness is the oil of personal relationships. And it's designed for us to be able to coexist, because people have expectations. We as human beings have expectations. And when those are not met, we get disappointed. And when we get disappointed, we go, it seems to me, two ways. We can either go down the blame and punishment route, or we can go down the empathy and forgiveness route. And it seems, in a way, perhaps it's easier to go down the blame and punishment route, where you take a position and draw a line in the sand. And this is a quote I like very much, and sort of says, I think, why that might be. James Baldwin, the writer, says, I imagine that one of the reasons that people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense, once hate is gone, that they will be forced to deal with the pain